Welcome to the Prevent the Preventable podcast, where we're on a mission to change the landscape of brain hemorrhages by driving awareness, delivering education, and pushing for real action. Now, brain hemorrhages affect millions of lives every single year. But at the Nathy Kate Moss Trust, we're committed to preventing them before they happen and funding pioneering research to advance treatment for when they do. In this podcast, we'll dive deeper into the world of brain hemorrhages because the more we understand, the more we can create real change, and together we can truly prevent the preventable. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Prevent the Preventable podcast. As always, I'm your host, Fiona Moss, and thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Before we get into anything today, I want to take a moment to reflect on our last episode with Katie. It's so easy to get caught up in what we're doing at NKMT, the events we're planning, the strategies we're mapping out, the numbers we're chasing, even when we're speaking to the research team at the University of Manchester and diving into complex technical science, we can sometimes become a little removed from the very human reality behind it all. Even for me, having experienced the devastating loss of somebody I loved to a brain hemorrhage, there are moments where the weight of why we do what we do can fade into the background. But our why is simple. It's about people. We do this to stop a young mother becoming a widow, to prevent parents from losing a child, to make sure children grow up with their parents by their side, to ensure brothers and sisters get to live long, happy lives together. That's why it's so important to share stories like Katie's, because they bring us back to our why and what truly matters, because we are all humans fighting for one another. And your support and willingness to create real change when it comes to brain hemorrhages, channeled through NKMT, is powerful. It's helping to prevent lives from being torn apart from this devastating issue. And for that, from the bottom of my heart, truly, thank you. Now, if you were particularly inspired by Katie's story or it resonated with you on a personal level, please let us know. We love hearing your feedback about the podcast. And the more we know about what you want to hear, the better we can tailor the podcast to you. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, now is the perfect time. Subscribing really does help. It means we can reach more people with all of this critical, potentially life-saving information. So if you could hit pause and subscribe right now, that would have such a big impact. Thank you. Now, onto today's episode, and it really is a crucial one. We're going inside those first few critical minutes after somebody suffers a brain hemorrhage, when every single second really does count. You might have heard the phrase, time equals brain, and today we'll explore exactly what that means as we speak to Chris Ashton. Chris has spent 24 years in the NHS, starting with the North West Ambulance Service as a paramedic before becoming an ambulance officer at Salford Royal Hospital. Alongside his NHS work, he lectures at MMU and Edge Hill University on acute stroke management and rehabilitation. Chris has co-chaired the National Prehospital Stroke Group as a specialist paramedic for NHS England and sits on many national panels, and in recent years has had a strong focus on clinical pre-hospital care, whilst also presenting some of his work at both the European Stroke Conference and the UK Stroke Forum Conference. So with all of that experience, which is a lot, we are so lucky to have him here to talk to us about what happens on the front line. From the moment somebody experiences symptoms, to when the ambulance gets calls, to when the patient arrives in hospital. How long does all of that take? Why does every single minute matter? What can be improved, and what can we do ourselves as loved ones or bystanders to improve the outcome for those patients in those first few critical minutes? We'll also explore the science behind the golden window after a hemorrhage and how research funded by the Nathy Kate Moss Trust is helping to advance emergency care and early intervention strategies. I have a feeling that this episode is not only going to be deeply informative, but practically will give our listeners some really vital information which could help improve the chance of survival for someone if they experience a brain hemorrhage. So, let's get started. Welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for being here on the Prevent the Preventable podcast. Now, today we're going to be speaking all about pre-hospital care And we're going to be exploring everything from how long it takes to get from somebody having the onset of a symptom to actually getting to the hospital. Quite often we think it's quite straightforward. We just ring the ambulance and then they appear and they get you to hospital. It's not that straightforward. And there are lots of things that can delay somebody getting to hospital. There are a lot of opportunities actually where we can improve the time to get somebody to hospital, and that's very important. And we'll explore why. So we're gonna touch on all of that, and hopefully, for those who are listening, they're going to be able to actually take away some really practical advice for what they could potentially do if they are faced with a situation where somebody does potentially present with a stroke. Before we go into all of that, could you tell us a little bit about your role to date and how long you've been working in emergency care?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for inviting me along. But in terms of my experience now, it's probably started at the turn of the millennium with the ambulance service, with North West Ambulance Service, and stayed with the ambulance service for 15 years as a paramedic. I then moved over to at the time, within Greater Manchester, we actually centralised our services, which meant that we reduced our hospitals that were delivering stroke care, and we went to what we call 3 hyper-acute stroke units at Salford, Bury and Stockport. At the time, when we did that, we needed something that was kind of the glue that sticks everything together and makes everything function rather than everyone working in silo. So they created a stroke network. At the time, it was called the Great Manchester Stroke Operational Delivery Network, which is a bit of a mouthful. Mm-hmm. But later on, the NHS England picked that up, the model, and replicated that across the country. So we do have now what we call integrated stroke delivery networks all over the country, of which we merged our name into the new ISDN. And I kind of coordinate that and facilitate a lot of the service improvement around that. I do a lot of work around the data. In terms of my paramedic hat, I still sit on quite a few national working groups, in terms especially around stroke, kind of a speciality now leading in stroke. And I've previously supported the National Medical Director in co-chairing a National Prehospital Stroke Working Group as well. And at the moment, I probably sit on quite a few panels in terms of where we go with stroke care, especially around pre-hospital. Do have lecturer positions as well, so I'm lecturing to new paramedics, trying to educate them on stroke recognition and the delivery of the stroke care pathway. So yeah, I've got a few hats now. It's good. I get to work with many of our stakeholders across the stroke pathway, both locally and nationally. And I think the biggest change in my work in recent years has been supporting our national audit team, which for people who are aware of stroke care, we have a national audit database called SNAP. It's the Sentinel Stroke National Audit Programme. So what happens is any patient who has a stroke and attends an acute stroke unit, the acute stroke unit enter their record into the national audit database. And that data is freely available to the general public. Anyone can go on the site and look at the care that's being delivered across the hospitals. Within the acute setting, there's scoring given to each centre, really. So they look at what they call an A to E scoring, like a rating. So you can see where the hospitals are working towards better care and improving their scores, which is great. It does drive stroke care. And I've been supporting that team more so from a pre-hospital angle. When the acute teams create the record, what happens is then they send it to the ambulance service, and the ambulance service enter their data into the record data set as well to join up the data and marry it, which is fantastic. But we never actually were doing anything with that data. And I've been attending and going to work with the SNAP team down in London occasionally to actually understand how we can make that data meaningful and use that data in a wise manner. And I'm sure we'll talk about it later on.
I think what's really interesting already is what you're saying is I think, the ordinary person would think, as I said before, you call the ambulance, sort of whichever paramedics that's nearby would come to you, and then you just go to your nearest hospital. And actually, what's really interesting about what you're saying is actually there are these systems that are going on in the background to ensure that somebody has the right care pathway as quick as possible, depending on what has happened to them. And I think understanding those systems and those pathways better will help us better understand, the care that somebody potentially would have as well. So as you mentioned, we'll go into all of that. We'll look at all the data and everything that you touched on there. But particularly when we're thinking about stroke, obviously, if we're thinking about improving this pathway, this stroke pathway, and creating systems, up here in the Northwest, but also across the country as well, we want to make sure that people are getting care as quick as possible. With most things, obviously, we want people to get care as quickly as possible. But actually, we hear this phrase quite a lot, that time equals brain. And there is this golden window to make sure that somebody does get care ASAP. Before we kind of go on to these studies, before we understand what the process, these care pathways, etc., look like, can you just explain why time is so critically important for stroke, but brain hemorrhage in particular?
Yeah, no problem. So I mentioned earlier that I watched a previous podcast that Stu Allen did with you, and he went into a lot of detail around the types of stroke and, the impact that can have. I think in terms of looking at the golden window specifically for ICH and into cerebral hemorrhage, I think it's threefold, really. I think firstly, we've got to prevent brain damage. We know that within ICH, it involves bleeding in or around the brain. We also know that that's going to naturally increase intracranial pressure. And with that, it will reduce the amount of oxygen that can get to the brain cells. And the longer it persists, that potentially is going to cause these brain cells to die. So what we need to do is potentially, secondly, reduce the hematoma expansion. If we've got bleeding in the brain, we need to reduce that bleeding. And in cases of ICH, we need to ensure that we've got early treatment to do that, which ultimately can mean lowering blood pressure and aggressive treatment around lowering the blood pressure. We know that that's going to be a major cause of neurological outcomes in terms of if we don't do that. And there's been some great work over the years from Adrian Parry-Jones at Salford Royal on how they can effectively do that as well and introduce pathways to do that. But ultimately, I think the third point I just wanted to make was we want to improve survival rates. We know ICH strokes often have the worst outcome for strokes, with up to 40% mortality at times. So we know 4 in 10 patients potentially may never leave hospital if presenting with ICH stroke. So yeah, essentially I would say it's threefold in terms of why we use that golden hour saying. We know that time is brain. We often hear that. And we know that up to 2 million neurons a minute die in an untreated stroke. Wow. That is why time is brain. Yeah. All them minutes that we can save essentially are saving brain cells, which in turn will reduce disability. It will reduce haemorrhage expansion in ICH, which will save the brain cells, reduce disability, and hopefully, depending on time spans and how quickly we get people to hospital, how quickly we can do a treatment, reduce mortality as well.
So you mentioned there about ICH, intracerebral hemorrhage. Is that the same for SAH, subarachnoid hemorrhage as well? Is that the same sort of dangers, I suppose, or risks that, somebody's going to potentially lose all those, cells in the brain that you touched on there?
You may have to excuse my medical knowledge in terms of the subacute hemorrhage pathways, when they get to hospital. But in essence of pre-hospital care, with my paramedic hat on, I would say all strokes should be treated equally with the essence of time. We often say we want to get people to the right place at the right time for the right care. And essentially, whatever subset of stroke we may be presented with. And as paramedics, we don't actually know what we're being presented with. I'm sure we'll speak about that later.
I think that's a massive difficulty. Maybe we will come on to it when we talk about time on scene. But I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, I would imagine, for you, is that without, MRIs or anything like that, anti-scanners, that you can't actually check what's actually happening internally for somebody.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And the gold standard, as you say, for recognising a stroke is a scan at hospital as soon as they get there. As paramedics, we don't have that. We feel like at times we've often got our hands tied behind our back. I often say this when I'm lecturing at universities to paramedics. With cardiac care and with someone having a heart attack or an MI, myocardial infarction, we have a 12-lead ECG that we can put on people that indicates they're having a heart attack. We don't have that with stroke. We don't have that point of care test that really, really has a high percentage rate that is the outcome. That is the diagnosis. So essentially, we're still using the FAST test, which is what came out in 1988, if I remember correctly, through the Department of Health England programme, to diagnose stroke. So we've not actually had the advancements in stroke care over the last 40 years, up to 40 years, that we would like. I do think we're at a turning point. I am excited. I say that often to paramedics on the university programmes. I think the amount of research ongoing at the moment regarding recognition of stroke and supporting the recognition of stroke is fantastic. And I really do think there's a breakthrough coming around the corner.
So just to skip ahead and we'll skip back.
But sorry.
Kind of as we're on it, no, I think it's a really helpful point that I mean, the way everything is moving with technology, and we had one of the research come in to talk about, AI, and AI technology, everything is moving at such a rapid pace. And that pace is only quickening in itself. Are there, or is there a potential that there might be some technology that can be, available to paramedics on the scene? As you said, you have things, if somebody's had a cardiac arrest, you can check their heart. You can't necessarily check their brain in the same way. But is there anything in the pipeline that you've heard about that potentially could offer that option to paramedics?
Yeah, and it's a great question. But in terms of results, I don't know the answers yet because obviously a lot of them are pilots. But yeah, there's some fantastic pieces of research out there at the moment. Things such as looking at purines in the blood to recognise ischemia in the early onset of ischemia that may help support. There is different pilots all across the world really looking at the difference between when a patient has an ischemic stroke, and depending on where that ischemic stroke is, so it's a large vessel occlusion, they can go on to have the intervention of thrombectomy, where we extract the clot from the brain through a catheter. There's pilots looking at that. There's things such as pilots measuring radio waves and magnetic waves and fluid shift in the brain, looking at the differentiation between stroke type as well. So yeah, there's lots of exciting pieces of research ongoing at the moment, and that's why I think there's potentially we're onto something. It may be that we don't have a point of care test that completely tells us a patient is having a stroke or a type of stroke, but what it will do, it will support with a percentage the likelihood of that being a stroke. So it may mean we recognise strokes we haven't recognised in the past. It may mean we can get a certain subtype of patients to hospital quicker than we used to.
Yep.
So it's definitely going to improve stroke care of the future, I think.
Yeah, which is really exciting in itself. Yeah. Because I think, as we're sort of alluding to, it's so critical, this point, from when somebody experiences an onset of symptoms to getting to hospital. Anything that we can do within that time frame to get them there quicker and then get them treated properly as quickly as possible, the better. So if, all of these opportunities, I think, because there are many and there will be many different things that can be done, and we'll touch on some of them today, the better. So let's kind of go on to that. So over the years, obviously, there's been an awful lot of studies that happen within hospitals. How can we treatment? What can we be doing? What, in terms of whether that's surgery, neurological surgery, or whether that is certain treatments such as the one we touched on already with Adrian, the ABC bundle. But very little analysis has been done pre-hospital, i.e. this time frame that we're talking about, from the onset of symptom to getting them through the doors at a hospital. And you touched on it earlier, is it SNAP, or would you say it like that?
Yeah,
okay. SNAP. Okay.
But it's a double S.
SNAP.
Yes.
And this is the analysis that you have been doing, and you've been collating all of the information from, I think, the 300,000 ambulance records.
Up to 300,000 records.
Yeah.
So over a 5-year period.
An awful lot of information. And obviously you go into it in 4 stages, if I'm right. So the first stage is onset to symptoms to calling an ambulance. That's stage 1, and we'll touch on these all individually. Second one being time for the ambulance to get to the patient. Third one being time that the paramedics are on the scene. And the fourth one being time it then takes to get that patient from the scene to the hospital. And there is lots of different nuances within each of those stages, which can delay, which can, stop somebody from getting treatment quicker. So let's kind of dive into that. But firstly, can you just kind of give us an overview of SNAP and what you've been working on specifically, and how you've kind of come to the conclusions on some of this data that you've come to?
Yes, no problem. I think you said the word there, conclusions. What I will say is, from this data set that we've observed, we've probably asked ourselves more questions than giving ourselves answers. But that's great, and I'll explain why that's great in a bit. But in terms of SNAP, I briefly mentioned it earlier. So the National Audit Programme have every stroke patient that attends an acute hospital entered into the system. Then records are sent to the ambulance service, and then the ambulance service over the last few years have been able to join up their metrics around time that they spent on scene, time travelling to hospital, etc., which has been fantastic, but nothing has happened with the data. So what, in my work supporting SNAP, we decided to look at this data, and one, it's now freely available on the SNAP website. So even the general public and the hospital teams and the ambulance service trusts can go on and observe the data and break it down to local catchment areas, so North West Ambulance Service, etc. But what I want to do is look at the data a little bit in more depth. And yes, we've got some metric and some timestamps, but we started to look at the last 5 years of data for the pre-hospital setting from, as you say, the onset of symptoms to arriving at hospital, which is broken down into the 4 elements you've explained. What we've seen over the last 5 years is there's a linear trend of declining patients from onset to arriving at hospital in a timely manner. It's actually increasing in length, worryingly.
And so how long is that length?
So we're coming up to 3 hours now.
Wow.
So from onset to arriving at hospital, at the end of the study, in the last quarter period of data, which was around early 2024, it was coming up to 3 hours. Now, in previous SNAP annual reports, that's been less. It's been around the 2 hours 20 in years gone by. And that's what I mean about there's a slight linear increase in that time, which is worrying. My question was why? We can't just look at the ambulance service and say, well, is it the ambulance service that are delaying responding to patients? It may not be. There may be other factors such as the patients actually, or the bystanders who recognise a symptom of a patient delaying that call. So what I've done is I've started to look at the records and broken down each of the elements, but started to look at some of the key variables that we think potentially could affect that. And some of the findings are very interesting in terms of why we're starting to see differences in the data. But as I said then, it's asking us more questions now to understand why. And we've only actually looked at the variables on sole variables. What we've not looked at are confounding variables. So I'll give you an example of that. Let's say in an ICH stroke, we know that the conscious levels may actually be worse and present worse than ischemic strokes or have a reduced consciousness levels. What we've then not looked at is the confounding variable of severity. So we know ICH strokes can be quite severe. Actually, is it severity that's driving one variable, or is it the other variable driving the other? Or is there many variables actually into working with one another to show us this decline in some certain aspects? So yes, we've been able to look at the data. And I was very lucky that we were selected last year to present that at the National UK Stroke Forum as a bit of a pilot data. We're looking to publish it in the future. So we've not actually confirmed the final figures yet because we're still playing with the period of data. But some of the findings, as I said, are really interesting.
Sorry to interrupt, but this one is actually quite important. We often get asked, what's one thing that you can do to help reduce your risk of a brain hemorrhage? Well, the answer is actually pretty straightforward. Check your blood pressure. And here's why. High blood pressure is one of the leading causes of brain hemorrhage. High blood pressure can affect anyone, and a third of the population has high blood pressure, and 50% of those people don't even know. But the good news is that high blood pressure can be managed, but we need to know our numbers first. So don't leave it to chance. We've made it super simple for you to remember. Sign up to our free monthly reminder service and we'll nudge you to check your blood pressure every month. Quick, easy, and no excuses. Tap the link in our show notes to sign up for your free reminders now, because if you can prevent it, why wouldn't you? Yeah, and I think, me from just somebody, it doesn't work in, a medical setting, or particularly obviously as a paramedic, and doesn't understand that. But even 2 hours 20 sounds a lot to me. And obviously that, I imagine that's an average number. So there'll be ones that are a lot longer. And obviously if it's now 3 hours, there'll be ones that are even longer than that. And so a 40-minute increase is huge, really, isn't it? Particularly when we go back to what you were saying before about, the importance of every single minute and how that can affect the brain as well. So obviously let's go into those 4 stages then. So the first stage, I have here that the average time for onset of symptoms to calling the ambulance, literally picking up the phone and calling the ambulance, is 87 minutes. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. Yes, it was roughly around 90 minutes in our study that we've just recently done. Like I say, when we look to publish this, it may change by a few minutes, but alarmingly, it's 90 minutes. I think you alluded to a great point earlier when you said it. Within the hospital trusts, they've often ran quality improvement projects that have shaved minutes off the stroke care pathway, which are fantastic. It could be the reduce someone arriving at the hospital to get into scan within 10 minutes. Amazing, fantastic. But actually, if we've got a 90-minute window of patients from onset, to ring in the ambulance, the education that we could possibly use in the community, I don't just mean locally, I mean nationally, could shave 20, 30 minutes off the pathway through better recognition.
Yeah.
So it's definitely an opportunity.
I think that's an opportunity, but also probably just so hard in terms of improving that time, because it's kind of out of your hands. As much as you can actually implement better education across communities, you're not there on scene to actually do anything about it, you know. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to improve. But why is it so long? What are the challenges that come with that sort of stage?
Yeah, I think that's what we're hoping when we look at the data and look at the confounding variables may actually show us in the future. We know that in most cases, stroke patients themselves can't ring an ambulance. Sometimes they won't even recognise they're having their own stroke. So it's quite often dependent on a bystander. Is the patient alone when they have the stroke? Is the patient with someone? Has the patient had symptoms just before they went to bed? Which was a frustration of mine as a paramedic when I was on the road. Quite often people say, well, this started last night. I just went to bed and I thought I could sleep it off. And unfortunately they hadn't, and obviously deteriorated. Had they missed an intervention window there where for ischemic stroke, we could give them thrombolysis or thrombectomy to try and remove or reduce the clot. In an ICH stroke, have we increased that likelihood of hematoma expansion because we've not got them there in a timely manner? So yeah, I think it's really important. It's probably gone back to the golden window, but as paramedics, we can't influence how quickly someone recognises stroke. So within this analysis, that's probably the factor that, as a pre-hospital clinician with that hat on, we're not going to influence. But what I wanted to do was make sure the whole pathway was recognised of where the delays might be, so that if we can improve in any aspect, whether it's the patient education aspect for ringing an ambulance, so the pre-hospital clinicians and the ambulance service trust can then, interact and carry out their care in a timely manner, then so be it.
Is it just recognition of symptoms that might be delaying people calling an ambulance, or also kind of this, I don't want to say head in sand, but kind of a bit of, I'll just sleep it off, it'll be fine sort of attitude? Or are there other things that might potentially delay somebody from calling an ambulance? I'm thinking, somebody potentially is already ill in some way, and they might just be thinking it's a symptom of what they're already dealing with.
Yes.
Or if somebody might be from a different culture, and actually ringing an ambulance might not be part of what they believe in, or whether just part of their culture and their community. I imagine there's lots of different factors, particularly in our country where it is very multicultural, or even if somebody lives very remotely and they might think, oh, I'm fine and I don't need to ring an ambulance to come out this far. There's lots of different things I'm sure that might play a part in that delay.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and I think you've asked about 5 questions in that one.
Yeah, sorry. You choose which one you want to answer.
So I think I'll start off with the first part of it. So I think just to give some context on the study we've done. So we've looked at each element of the care pathway. So let's use onset to call as an example. We've then looked at the median point, which you alluded to is 87 minutes. Well, let's call it 90 for the sake of a few minutes. And then we looked at either side of the median. So the patients who rang before the median and the patients who rang after the median. What we found for some of the trends were the patients ringing after the median. One of them was people who have previous hypertension, so high blood pressure, which is obviously a comorbidity. I think you alluded to it then. The hypothesis is, could that group of patients be thinking, oh, this is just my hypertension playing up and delaying potentially ringing an ambulance, rather than having and flipping the mindset? Well, actually, if that is a risk factor of stroke and you have hypertension, and we know the percentage of patients going on to have secondary strokes at times is high, should that not flip the mindset, hopefully, to ring the ambulance quicker, or at least make contact with someone who has got a little bit of it, understanding that, wait a minute, this could be a secondary stroke or it could be a stroke. Let's contact 999. I think that's the point of people with previous comorbidity. I think within the data set, that we're analysing, and this is probably breaking ground, we're hoping to publish this in the future, but the pilot data we're looking at is showing us deprivation. may actually affect as well how quick and how timely people ring an ambulance. And people living in less deprived areas may have a delayed contact with the ambulance service as well. That potentially could be seen in some ethnicity groups. The data we're looking at doesn't really show us significance in the ethnicity, but we do know in some areas, and maybe some certain religious groups or ethnic groups, when presenting with symptoms, quite often will contact someone in their own community for advice, really, rather than ringing 999. And it was very timely. I seen a great post on social media yesterday from the Stroke Association regarding how quickly people should be ringing an ambulance upon recognition of symptoms. And I thought that really poignant in terms of, actually, it's about everyone. Everyone needs to be educated, rather than just try and maybe sleep on the symptoms or contact loved ones and say, well, I'll take myself to hospital tomorrow or tonight after work. You may present at your local hospital and that actually not be a stroke centre. And then you have to have a secondary transfer after assessment, which can delay presenting to the right place at the right care for the right time. So ringing an ambulance is probably the most important factor upon recognition, because the paramedics and ambulance technicians who will attend on the vehicle do know the pathways for the local areas and will take you to the most appropriate place of care depending on what you're presenting with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because as I said earlier, sometimes you don't think about these things. You think just you go to hospital and any hospital will resolve whatever problems it is that you're having. But I do think this is really important to kind of just make this point that, if somebody does experience any symptoms, that they should be calling an ambulance straight away regardless. And not, I think there's many factors, you talked there about cultural influences, comorbidities, blood pressure being a key part of that. But there's probably also something around just people just wanting to put their head in the sand and just hope that it just goes away. I think we can all do that in different circumstances. But something like this, when we talk about time equals brain, it's so important to be, getting on the phone to the ambulance and making sure that, you get that care as well. In that situation, if somebody thinks somebody is having a stroke, we're talking about the importance of more people recognizing the symptoms. If they think they're having a stroke, what should they be looking out for? And at what point should they go, right, yes, I know, I definitely need to call an ambulance?
Yeah, so I took part in one of our local stroke introductory study days, educating people working with the hospital trust a few days back when I presented about the pre-hospital. And at the time, I showed them some data around the FAST campaign that happened last year. So there was a bit of research and study done prior to that to look at how they could improve the FAST campaign. And actually, it was quite alarming and really worrying that in some aspects, people actually believed with the FAST tests, which is face, arm and speech, they needed 2 or 3 of them to actually be FAST positive and think that they were having a stroke. That's quite alarming, that actually we only need 1 of them symptoms that indicates that a person may be having a stroke. And 999 is obviously the immediate call that needs to be made. The percentages that believed that 2 or 3 symptoms had to be present is a little confusing, because the FAST campaign has never portrayed that. It's always portrayed the face, arm or speech, any of them being positive indicates that, a positive FAST test. What I would say is stroke's not easy to diagnose. Even for paramedics, ambulance technicians, even GPs working in primary care, even when patients arrive at a hospital, it's quite often, and I'm sure the stroke clinicians who you've sat on the podcast with will tell you the same. And that's why we go back to that CT scan is really important in terms of diagnosis. We have the FAST test that will pick up the majority of strokes, but we also have strokes that occur in the posterior part of the brain that won't present as FAST positive. And they may have symptoms such as ataxia or loss of balance. They may have vision problems. They may have vertigo, and they may have vomiting. They're just some of the subtle markers that we may be looking at as paramedics and ambulance technicians when we're presented with what we call a FAST negative stroke, or a patient who's got symptoms but got FAST negative symptoms, which then may educate us to think, actually, could this be a stroke, but presenting in a different way? So that's something that probably isn't ever educated to the general public. But again, it's an indicative of potential stroke in a different part of the brain.
Yeah, I think it's your point that it can make it confusing because sometimes, as you say, they're not necessarily the just face, arms, speech. It could be all these other pieces, and I'm sure there can be degrees of those as well. But I think if anyone's listening to this that is recognizing, well, if I know those symptoms, I need to make sure that I call an ambulance as soon as possible. I think if anyone takes anything from today, that should be the most important piece that they take from today.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the thing we've not touched upon is irrespective of age.
Yeah.
Age doesn't come into it. You can have a stroke, whether you're 16 years old or you're 86 years old. We do know within stroke, the average median age is in the mid-70s. And that's something that we never touched upon earlier with the question about delaying a ring in an ambulance. We have to remember the population and the larger majority of people who are having a stroke are in the mid-70s and onwards. How often are they living in their own home alone? What support do they have? Is there a group of patients who may be living in a nursing home or supported accommodation? These are all factors that we may have to consider when actually that 90-minute window that we were quite shocked about from onset to call can be influencing this. And we do know from the data that I've looked at already that age, the younger population are actually ringing earlier. The elder population don't. But what I often found as a paramedic with my hat on is quite often I would attend to a 999 call and the elderly population would say to us, I didn't want to bother you. They were of that mindset. They didn't like to bother us. And immediately you have to try and educate them, say, no, please, you have to ring us. And if this happens again, please ring us.
Is that also kind of a point of, if somebody who is, if one of us was sat here and presented with any of these symptoms, we're going about our day, we're, doing things which require quite a lot of thought and, presence, and those symptoms would massively disrupt that. For a lot of older people, as you kind of alluded to, they might be in a care home. If anyone's visited care home, that a lot of old, they are sat around a little bit, and so those symptoms might not be so obvious, if we put it that way. Is that a major factor as well?
Possibly. Yeah. And we touched upon comorbidities anyway. We know that the likelihood of secondary strokes is quite high at times. But if people are presenting with comorbidities where they've got previous hypertension, they've got previous atrial fibrillation, things like that are secondary risk factors to having a stroke. But at times people may go down the wrong path, is the only way I can look at it. And again, it's a hypothesis at present. We will have to do more analysis into the data to start looking at how the confounding variables affect one another. But yeah, I think, as I said, it's not easy to diagnose. No,
but I suppose that the key thing is just let's get the paramedics there as soon as possible, and then they can take over. So if we're ever worried, it's not about wasting people's time. It's not about sleeping it off or anything that we've spoken about. It's about getting that care as soon as possible, because time equals brain.
Yeah.
So hopefully with all of that, if we can get more people educated around, the importance of calling an ambulance as soon as possible, the better. And we can reduce that quite significant chunk of that 3 hours. Half of that is essentially onset to call, So the next stage is ambulance travel time to scene. And to my understanding, that's 18 minutes. So significantly less than, that first stage as well. What would get somebody a quicker response? Because surely there is a huge the variability between, it's not all 18 minutes. There's going to be some of that a lot longer, some of that a lot quicker. What would get a quicker response? Is it just about proximity, or are there other things that play a role?
Yeah, potentially, because when you ring 999, you actually go through a set list of triage questions that are the same for everybody, irrespective. There are two triage platforms that are used within the UK, which is NHS Pathways and something called AMPDS, which is like a computer-based program with set list of questions. Irrespective of the questions, essentially proximity of the ambulance to the address is the thing that will, and resource of ambulances that are available. Quite often we see some of the news articles of ambulances queuing up at hospitals waiting to hand over patients where unfortunately there's no beds, and that can happen. That is probably a daily occurrence around the country at some hospitals. I always use the analogy of an ambulance service is like a football manager, and at half time he has 11 players walk off the field, but at half time you say to him, right, choose which 5 players you want to take off the pitch, go back on the game and win the game. Well, he's going to struggle to do that. So the ambulance service are not going to get to people in as a timely manner if they've got less resource, because half the resources are stuck at hospitals. And I don't think sometimes people understand the impact of that. But yes, that's going to reduce potentially an ambulance being available and closer to an address. From the data and the data we're looking at, the pilot data at the moment with the SNAP team, we are starting to see some trends in terms of, I mentioned earlier, previous hypertension seems to be delaying patients ringing quicker. What we're seeing now is people with previous AF, so with atrial fibrillation, which is a risk factor of stroke, it can go on to cause stroke, they ring quicker. We've also got that happening when they ring an ambulance and they get asked the triage questions. That's replicated in the data. So people with previous AF. But what we've not been able to do is then look at the previous AF patients, what they are linked to in terms of severity, consciousness level, all the things that when you ask the triage questions, essentially with stroke care, the majority of people will fit into what we call a category 2 call, category 2999 call, which essentially is an 18-minute window. And the majority of them fall in that. When they won't fall in that is when people may be unconscious, for example, or their airway may not be protected because they're unconscious. So when people get asked the question in regards, are they breathing? If someone may not know, that may increase the likelihood of it being a higher category call, which is the category 1, which kind of, for people who don't work in the ambulance service, will trump the category 2, if that makes sense. And they would travel to that patient first. So yeah, I think proximity is the ultimate answer, but there are also, depending on how the patient presents, would influence whether the patient maybe gets a category 2 or a category 1 call as well.
So how they present and the answers to those questions is, because to your point before about somebody saying, well, I don't want to disturb you, and kind of answering the questions in a way of like, oh, I'm okay. If they're ringing about themselves, maybe, they've got blurred vision or they're being sick and they're by themselves or whatever those symptoms may be. And they present on the phone as if they don't want to trouble the paramedics.
Yeah.
How much is it down to the person calling and their answers versus the person on the other end of the phone ensuring that they're recognizing the severity of the situation without actually even being there? Like, is there any sort of contradiction or challenge with that?
It's probably difficult to answer, not being a call taker and being in the ambulance service in that element of, understanding.
Yeah. Because I imagine on the flip side as well, there might be people going, oh no, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. And it's not actually as bad as maybe, what you would determine as category 1, category 2, etc.
Yeah. I think subconsciously, everyone's different.
Yeah.
So what you deem as an emergency may be slightly different than what I deem as an emergency or what the viewer deems as an emergency. We have to look. That's why I think having triage questions in the way the ambulance service do is quite black and white.
Yeah.
But it kind of, does it eliminate that emotion? Possibly. So people are getting the right response at that time. So I think looking at hemorrhagic strokes and ICH, I think what's interesting is when we looked at the onset to call, hemorrhagic strokes were ringing quicker than ischemic strokes.
Okay.
Is there a hypothesis on that? Potentially. Have we got any concrete evidence? No, because we've not studied it yet. But potentially, hemorrhagic strokes may be presenting far more severe. They may be presenting with reduced consciousness level, and they may be presenting with sudden onset of severe pain, which we know can happen often.
Such as a thunderclap headache or something?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Quite often, people will say to us, I felt like I had a bat on the head. That's what I remember vividly as a paramedic in some ICH strokes in terms of the pain. Pain, for me, going back to the question of the emotional side of it and it becoming an emergency, people react on pain, I think. It goes back to cardiac. We have quite often central chest pain. it indicates someone, I need an ambulance. Is it that these are all linked in terms of hemorrhagic strokes in the presentation that we often see with them and why they're potentially ringing a little bit earlier? The questions they get asked on the phone would then say, these are far more severe. They may have reduced consciousness. They may not be, they may be unconscious, so they get a quicker response. Yeah. Again, you can see now, I'm hoping to show you that all these variables are possibly linked. And I think this is why this data set, although we've looked at single variables at the moment, I think this opportunity now is massive for research in the future, even potential PhD students to go away and look at this data to say, we need to really, really understand the impact of all the variables affecting ICH stroke versus ischemic stroke, for example, which we haven't done yet. And I think that is a game changer in terms of helping then paramedics, because when we arrive on scene, paramedics and ambulance technicians can't really differentiate between, there is no tool to differentiate between ischemic stroke and ICH stroke. If we can get the right studies done in the future on this data set, I think there's something there.
Thank you to our sponsors, Hugh James Solicitors, for supporting this second series of the Prevent the Preventable podcast. Now, sudden brain hemorrhage can turn your world upside down, but discovering it was caused by a medical mistake makes it even more devastating. While nothing can change what's happened, Hugh James's medical negligence team is here to support those who suffered brain injury or bereavement due to medical errors. And their support doesn't end there. The Hugh James Wills and Estate team is also on hand to help you plan for the future with clarity and care, because when the worst happens, the last thing you need is added complexity. To find out more about how they can support you and your loved ones, head to the services page on our website and book a free call with them to discuss your concerns. You can find the link to all of that in our show notes. Feels very hopeful because, and we'll go on to the other stages in a second, but already it feels like there are lots of opportunities. There are a lot of things that we can say, this is delaying it and that's delaying it, but they're all opportunities. And if we can highlight what is delaying somebody getting the right treatment, there are plenty of opportunities for us to go after to get somebody care quicker and hopefully improve the outcomes. And that's what all of this is about.
And reduce mortality.
Reduce mortality. Yeah, a huge one. As you said before, 40% of those people won't leave the hospital, which is a really high number, and if we can say, okay, well, 50% of the time, 90 minutes, getting somebody to the hospital is just delaying of people recognizing symptoms. If there are issues with, getting the ambulance there as quick as possible, etc., there's lots of opportunities for us to improve that time, as you say, the outcome and mortality rates. So let's talk about time on scene now. So we mentioned before, time for the ambulance to travel there is 18 minutes. So the time on scene on the median is 32 minutes. Firstly, can you talk us through what happens when a paramedic arrives on scene? Because obviously there must be a few minutes of kind of setting up, understanding what's going on. That's a few minutes in itself. But then what's happening in the rest of that time to make it, over half an hour?
Yeah, so there's actually been some great studies on this. One of my fellow colleagues, Graham McClelland, up in the Northeast, specialist stroke paramedic, he's done some studies on actual time on scene, the breakdown of it and understanding it. So that paper would be a great read to answer that question. But in terms of just the basic understanding, I think in terms of when we arrive, firstly, we've got to find the address. That can be problematic at times, especially at night time, when people's door numbers are not lit up correctly. Again, it can slow time down. Gaining entry. We mentioned it earlier. Stroke patients quite often could live alone. They could have pulled a care on call card if they've had a fall from the stroke and be living alone. We may have to force entry at times to the house if we can see someone, in difficulty. Sometimes if we can't see anyone and there's no reason to force, we may have to wait for police assistance to gain entry to a property. We may have to wait for relatives that are en route with a key to gain entry. So there's lots of factors just before we even gained entry to a property. Once we ascertain the patient and obviously explain who we are and why we're there, you can kind of, from that initial conversation, understand if there may be any consciousness level problems, any cognition problems, if people are not able to process the things you're saying. And we'll take a history. Obviously, we'll take a history on people's previous comorbidities, people's previous risk factors, any previous stroke. All while we're doing this, we're kind of subconsciously doing a fast test. But we'll also ask the patient to pass the arm test, etc. Really interestingly, and I don't mind holding my hands up, my stroke education from when I first started was very limited. Again, I say this to paramedics when I'm lecturing. It was 2 slides on a PowerPoint for stroke care, essentially, when I did my paramedic training or my ambulance technician training initially back in the turn of the millennium. And other than the fast test, as I said earlier, there wasn't much to promote. But ultimately, we can do the fast test wrong. People at times may think, well, just test the grip strength and that's testing their arms. But people can have a strong grip. But if you actually ask them to hold their arms at 90 degrees, could fail a fast test because their arm could drift slightly, but they could still have a good grip. So there can be a little bit of confusion. And at times, even I hold my hands up in that actually, did I get it right all them years, 25 years ago, in correctly performing the fast test? Because I've never been shown that there was a correct way. But it is, a 90 degree test. So that's really poignant that we make sure that that's done correctly.
What factors would mean that maybe somebody stays on scene longer? So that they're coming there, they're checking the patients, that they're doing the fast test, they're kind of asking all these questions. What would mean that they don't just get them in the ambulance as soon as possible, treat them in the ambulance and get them off? Why would they stay at scene? What's happening there?
So as soon as we've done the fast test and we recognise that a patient may be fast positive, we've then got to think about extraction. People may live high up in a flat. People may have fallen. Quite often with strokes, we can have people who have fallen because of the stroke symptoms. They may have woke up in the morning, may have lost the use in the leg, or lost use in their arm, and they've had a fall. They may be trapped in a toilet. They may be trapped. Quite often we get people trapped in small bathrooms. So there's lots of factors to consider for extrication of patients out of the house. We've then got to consider, if we're taking the patient out of the house, who are we informing? Have they got relatives? Do we need to contact them? So we're not just going to take someone out, we've got to secure the property. Is there a key? We've got to find the key. We've then got to think about, well, we need to take the medications for the patient with us, because that's really important when the stroke clinicians are considering medications to treat potential stroke, and then any contraindications they may have because of the medications they take. We've then got to think about things such as, are they on anticoagulants? If they're on anticoagulants, and this probably links into ICH and a piece of work we did in Greater Manchester, we have different pathways for people on anticoagulants. We need to get them quicker to hospital in a more timely manner, because if it is an ICH and the patient's having a bleed and they've got hematoma expansion and they're taking blood thinners, that's going to increase the likelihood of that expansion being more. So we need to get them to hospital quicker so that people and the specialist stroke clinicians can deliver the bundle of care for that group of patients. We essentially need to get them to scan quicker to firstly find out if it's an ischemic stroke or an ICH stroke, because the two care pathways are completely different. So I think it's really understanding that 32 minutes, when we looked at the 90 minutes earlier, we were quite shocked at the onset to call. When you start to think of 30 minutes, you then, all the things I've just mentioned, you understand.
Quick. Yeah, you actually.
Yeah, that's not that bad now.
Yeah.
And what we've found is over the 5 years, that 30 minutes is more or less 1 or 2 minute change has stayed quite consistent. So it looks like paramedics are treating stroke time on scene in a timely manner. 1 or 2 minute fluctuations we may see, but it's not really changed over that 5 years.
So you mentioned that there's not been much difference with that 32 minutes. What to go back to stage 1? Was there much difference, or has that always been about 90 minutes?
No. So
or has that changed?
Yeah, that's changed. So it used to be lower. The median for the 5 years period we looked at was 87. At the latter end of the study, 5-year study, it was up to 90. But it was lower than the 87 median at the start. Okay. It was more or less around the 10 minute window of change.
Is there a reason for that?
We don't know, but we're hoping the data and the secondary analysis we may be able to do on the data and the confounding variables will start to tell us that.
Yeah, I think this is why I think this is so interesting, the work that you're doing, because we can assume a lot, right? But once you have the hard concrete data in front of you, then you can actually say, okay, well, this has increased, this has stayed the same. This is a lot longer than we think it should be. And this is where we need to focus our energies. But without that, you're kind of just guessing, so to speak, aren't you?
Yes.
And I think, breaking it down like this is really, really key. And it feels to me like the two key areas are, stage 1, onset to call, and then this third stage, which is at the scene, which, as to your point just now, it's actually not that long when you consider everything that you need to do when you're on the scene. Yeah. But they do feel like two places where the bystanders or, the relatives or whoever it is who's on the scene with the patient can potentially play a bit of a role in helping to improve that time. So we spoke about the first one being recognizing the symptoms in terms of stage 1. In this third stage, time on scene, is there anything that the bystanders can do to help the paramedics to improve that time? You spoken, or you touched on things like collecting medications, things like keys, helping get access to the property, leaving the property,
kin details,
all those sort of things. What can people do in that situation? And actually, stroke or anything else, I assume, I imagine the same, any emergency, what can they do on scene to help the paramedics to get the patient into the ambulance as quick as possible?
So I always tell my mum off, and she'll shout at me for this, but I always tell her the house needs to be more tidy. But it's a simple little thing like that, that we've got to think about. If in an emergency situation in your home, how quickly could someone get you out?
Yeah.
I know it sounds critical, but it's what drives our timely care. That's a marker that can slow us down.
Well, I suppose to your point before, when you're talking about minutes matter, if you're then trying to navigate through a load of stuff on the floor, or you can't get into a room because it's so untidy for whatever reason, it does make a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, and quite often people with stroke presentation will have a disability, whether it's arm or leg, so they may not be able to walk. So essentially we do have to carry a majority of patients out or use a wheelchair to get people out. We have to consider, have we got access with a wheelchair? People may have access to walk, and this is not just in people's homes that I'm being critical of now. This is in the workplace. Stroke can happen anywhere, so it's considerations for and the workplace is slightly different. And nowadays, with fire safety hazards and trip hazards, etc., it's a lot better. But in terms of additional considerations that we think about in terms of helping paramedics and ambulance technicians, I think history is the biggest one. So quite often people won't have a list of their medical history. The data's showing us that as paramedics and technicians, anyone with any comorbidities, so that goes to previous atrial fibrillation, previous hypertension, previous TIA or stroke, and anyone on anticoags, we are actually staying on scene longer than the group who are getting more timely leaving scene. That's probably because once you divulge that information, we need to ask more questions around that. We need to potentially do more tests around that just to make sure that it is a stroke rather than some of them factors affecting your presentation. That is the hypothesis around why that may cause paramedics to stay on scene a little bit longer. So anything you can do as a member of the public, as a family relative, even as the patient themselves, if you could have clear lists of your history or even your medications alongside that, that is massively beneficial in the instance that you ever do need an ambulance. As you said, not just for stroke, but for any condition.
Yeah, it's like the preempting the organisation, isn't it?
Yeah. And we're not all organised, even I know I'm not.
I think it does say a lot. We've recorded an episode in this series about wills and legacies, and we don't think about these things until we need them.
That's correct.
And I suppose it's the same in this instance. You don't think about, I need to prepare for when the paramedics come, and hopefully they don't. But it's just in case that happens, that could make a massive difference in terms of the outcome of the patient, whether that means survival or not, or actually just in terms of severity of disability as well. So I think it's just making people aware of how important those things could be too, and the difference that could make for people as well. Just quickly on that, you talk about having a list of medications, things. A lot of people do use their iPhones and the health app to log different aspects of their health, medications, allergies, etc. As paramedics, do you ever use them?
So having been off the road for 10 years now, frontline consistently, obviously I was doing a few shifts. I probably couldn't answer that with hand on heart.
Yeah.
I would like to think times have changed, and paramedics and ambulance technicians, yes, are using more and are more tech savvy. We also have to remember that due to the change in education around paramedics and ambulance technicians, the route into the ambulance service now is through university.
Okay.
So it's a lot younger, the population of paramedics and technicians, in terms of probably the median age of when I started back at the turn of the millennium. And social media and technology has changed over the years, and that generation of the population has grown with it. So they are a little bit more savvy. The worry is, and the question I would ask is, our median age of mid-70s for our stroke population, they probably aren't in hindsight.
Yeah. Huge thank you to Colony Co-working for continuing to support the Preventable podcast. Now, at the Nathalie Kate Moss Trust, we have a huge ambitions to completely change the landscape of brain hemorrhages. And whilst we're a small but mighty team, we're all working remotely. And in truth, that's part of our strength. Remote working means that we can connect with incredible talent from across the UK and around the world, helping us push forward faster and smarter. But without a central office, we need flexible, inspiring spaces where we can come together to work productively, collaborate meaningfully, and work on this huge goal we have set ourselves. That's where Colony comes in. Colony is a growing network of beautifully designed co-working spaces here in Manchester, home to creatives, founders, freelancers, and teams of all sizes. They are spaces built for focus, connection, and progress. Not just a place to work, but an environment that actively supports your growth. And they've helped NKMT do just that. To find out more about how Colony could support your business, check the link in the show notes. I suppose it's just one other way to kind of just check in on medications, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really easy thing. So, okay. So, and then the final stage is time to hospital, which is very similar to time to scene. I imagine there's very similar sort of, challenges there or issues. I mean, that's probably pretty straightforward. Really, it's about communicating with the hospital, traffic, I suppose, access to the hospital from where you are, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any major challenges and therefore major opportunities within that phase?
Yeah, potentially. So with this phase, what we have to remember is the travel into hospital is based on geography. And yes, we've studied all records of patients, whether they live down on the south coast all the way up to the northern border in Scotland. And we do have green areas, we do have urban city areas. Potentially in Manchester, as an example, you could be at any hospital, give or take a few minutes, 15 minutes, wherever you may sit. However, let's just go up a little bit north into the Lake District. That could be potentially an hour and a half, 2 hours. So even in just our local area, we could see the differences. So understanding the data from a national perspective, looking at the medians, I think is great. I think what we found in the data is there's not many clear differences in actually travelling to hospital in what the patient's differentiation is. What we have found is, and I linked onto this earlier, the most deprived get to hospital quicker. But is that because they're presenting with more comorbidities, more severe strokes? They have greater risk factors because of lifestyles. Again, we don't know that because that's probably the next stage of any analysis from this data that we need to do. So there's, again, lots of hypotheses, lots of questions. But from an initial point of view, what we are seeing is, again, hemorrhagic strokes and ICH do get to hospital quicker when we divide that group into two subsets either side of the median. And that links in with the onset to call, the travelling to the patient as well. When we get on scene, that doesn't change with the paramedics. So there is no differentiation between ischemic. And I actually think that's a good thing because it means paramedics, irrespective of the presentation of stroke, treat them in the same way. So that's a good thing for the profession and a good thing for patients to know as well. But wonder what the impact of them severe hemorrhagic strokes and potential pain, potential reduced consciousness that we often see are having on this data set.
Yeah.
So that'll be really interesting to look at in the future, dividing ischemic and potential hemorrhagic stroke.
Yeah, we've touched on it a few times. There's so many variables.
Yes.
And I mean, that makes it so hard from, it's not just geographical, but demographics and age and, the list goes on and on and on. And I think, but if we can keep building on this data, to your point before, this is one of the first of its kind, this analysis. And I think it's a very impressive sort of, report that really gives us an insight into where there are challenges. And therefore, as we said before, therefore, where there are opportunities as well. And that could have a huge, huge impact on the outcome for stroke, and obviously our focus hemorrhagic stroke patients as well, which is really exciting for me, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners as well, whose lives have been touched by hemorrhagic stroke. To round up, and we've touched on them probably a number of times, so if we can summarize, what are the biggest gains that we can have, and what are the things that the listeners can do to improve the time it takes to get somebody to hospital and make sure they're getting the right care that they need?
Yeah, I think the biggest point I can push forward is don't doubt yourself. Just call. Don't even consider, well, it might be this or it might be this. Call and then worry about, well, it might be this or it might be this. And actually, that's probably the best way to do it. Call for the ambulance, explain the presentation, and then start thinking about what the potential is. As you said, the paramedics and the ambulance technicians are probably, and generically, if we think of the whole population, probably more educated. They're seeing it on a daily basis. It's probably their bread and butter.
The key point, and what I'm picking up, is like, let's just get them in as soon as possible, and then we can make that call. What do they need? And I think that's the theme of today, isn't it? We said right at the beginning about time equals brain. And actually that time to get them to hospital is so important. So any opportunity where we can reduce that time, the better. And I think the key point that you pointed out, and as we spoke right at the beginning, and half that time is down to the public, the bystanders, the relatives, the person who's suffering from it. So if we can get them to not wait, to your point, don't wait, don't think about it, just call the ambulance and they'll make the decisions thereafter. But there are lots of opportunities, as you've alluded to, that we can improve that. So I mentioned it earlier, it feels hopeful, and it feels like there's a lot that we can do to improve the outcomes for brain hemorrhage patients, and obviously stroke patients generally as well. And I'm so pleased that, this work is being done and this data set is being done as well, because it's going to help, hopefully, thousands of people every single year. So thank you so much, Chris.
No problem. They always say evidence drives care, but data drives care as well. Yeah. If we have the evidence to understand what we're presented with, we can drive that care in the future.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say a huge thank you to Chris today for giving us such a clear and powerful insight into what really happens in those first few critical hours after somebody has a brain hemorrhage. His experience on the front line from ambulance to A&E reminds us just how urgent, complex and vital those early decisions are. We spoke a lot about time today and the importance of rapid recognition of symptoms, fast action and expert response, because every single minute can quite literally be the difference between life and death. It's an incredibly high stakes environment, and we are so grateful to the professionals working in that space every single day. As always, if you found this episode valuable, please do share it, because the more people who are aware of this information, the more people who are prepared to act quickly when they might need to, can make a world of difference.